San Diego, welcome to Bob Behnke.
Test, test. Everybody hear me? Okay. So, a little bit about myself, technical service manager. My business card, we just handed that out to you guys. Every bottle has an 800 number on that bottle that rings to my group. If you want me, just ask for Bob. We also, in our group, we have two people who do testing, and they'll test competitive products or anything new that comes out on the marketplace. Also, if a question comes up I can't answer, we'll run a test, determine what is the correct answer from there. So, and there's a few things that we'll go through that we've tested that have broken kind of some of the rules that we've typically gone through. So this is a discussion. I'm not just going to talk at you guys because you'll be asleep in about 5 minutes. This is kind of a question and answer session, and I do have most of the questions as I go around the country is included in this. So I may tell you, let's wait on that question until we get to the slide. It helps a little bit better to go through that. But if something comes up, you've got a question, raise your hand. I want to make sure that we answer all the questions that you have. In addition, I'll stay a little bit longer afterwards. I know some people don't like to ask questions right up front. And so I'll stick around for any questions that you guys have, okay? So this is not going to be an advertisement for Titebond. If you've come for an advertisement, you'll be sorely disappointed. However, this is going to be a discussion about glue technology. Actually, the presentation is the 5 steps of good gluing. But we've got to go through a lot of stuff before that occurs. So we're going to focus on wood in this presentation. We do glues that will do plastics and everything else. So if you've got questions on that, that'll be fine, but we're going to kind of try and focus more on wood. Okay? And we all love wood because, hey, it's easy to work with, but it's gorgeous, it's beautiful, just like this log that's sitting in front of us. But because it's a natural product, there are certain properties of the wood that are going to affect not only the gluing of the product, but also some of the, properties of the projects that we're going to be working on. One of them is wood density. So a lot of the questions that we get, the question is, I need your strongest wood glue. But that's not always the case. So when we're looking at adhesives, the way that I'm going to look at things, we look at, I've got substrate A that I'm gluing together, then I've got the interface between the substrates, then I've got the glue itself, then I've got the interface between substrate B, and then I've got substrate B. And what we call that is, we call this the chain of adhesion, right? And so I had a guy call me, and he was like, I need your strongest glue. I said, well, what are you doing? And he said, well, I make model airplanes. And if you're thinking about that, he was working with balsa. And I told him, I said, you really don't need my strongest glue, right? Because balsa is going to break somewhere between, 40 and 80 PSI in that particular case. So really, you could have a 10,000 PSI glue, but that structure is still going to break at 40 to 80 PSI. So again, you don't necessarily always need my strongest glue. Look at the density of the wood. Typically, the lower the density of the wood, the weaker that wood's going to be. The higher density of the wood, the stronger that's going to be. And in some cases, you'll get into some of the tropicals, which are actually going to be stronger than the glue. And so in a lot of cases, people go, well, it broke wood, so it's stronger than the wood. Well, there are some cases where the wood is going to be stronger than the glue. Even everybody's got a bottle of the speed set that we've got out. That's our newest product. That's actually our strongest product. It goes up to about 4,100 PSI. As a matter of fact, we are finding it more difficult to find wood that actually breaks at the strengths that some of these glues do. And so as we look at the chain of adhesion, right, if I break a piece of wood and I get wood failure, I'm not really measuring the strength of the glue at that point in time. I'm measuring the strength of the wood. And so in that case, that doesn't help us as researchers to try and find that. So again, we just want you to just be cognizant of the fact that there is what we call a chain of adhesion. You only have to be as strong as you need. And as a matter of fact, you can go back even further is, the wood is as strong, but if I'm making a picture frame. So what is the process or what is the stresses that your project is going to see? And these all become important in terms of finding the right glue for your application, okay? So if you're using water-based wood glue, which most of the PVAs that you see out on the market, usually are about 50% solids. So they're going to be about 50% water, and they have to dry to build strength. And we're going to go through the drying process in a little bit. But there is a point, such as this log which was sawn just last night, there is a point where there's more water in the wood than the wood wants to take in. And that point is going to be about 17% moisture content, right? And so at 17% moisture content, I could glue something up, but the glue is just not going to dry. And so normally we'll get calls on the phone, and the calls will start as, your glue sucks. And it is just very kind of a little frustrating. Understood though that you're spending a lot of time, a lot of effort and stuff, and if you glue something up and then it comes apart after you take the clamps off, it can be a bit frustrating for you guys. But what I can tell you is with our quality systems that we have in place at Franklin, it's not rocket science to make PVAs. And as a matter of fact, I'll put up a formula for you guys to write down in a little bit. But it's not that difficult to make. We have great quality programs at Franklin. I couldn't say that about some of the other companies I've worked for, but I won't mention who they are. So I can absolutely tell you it's not going to be the glue. And that's why we kind of go out and do these presentations, is try to get you guys thinking what in the process could cause this to happen. Now, if you take your glue comes apart, you take your clamps off, it comes apart and the glue's still wet, right? That's not the glue's fault. If you have figured out how to keep glue from drying, which is how to keep water from evaporating, please let me know. We're going to be very rich, right? Because the Saudi Arabians would love to learn how to keep water from evaporating. So again, there's going to be a certain amount where the glue is not going to dry. Now, as I talk about all of these things, about open time, working time, things like that, all of ours are done at 7 to 8% moisture content of the wood, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 50% relative humidity. So if your conditions are different from that, let's say I'm at the coast, that may be different, and let's say if I'm inland a ways, it's going to be even different from that. And so we want to just be cognizant of these moisture content differentials and how they will affect our gluing. So let's take a look at some of the changes in terms of dimensional changes for wood, right? So wood is not an even product like plastic. It won't expand and contract the same in each area. But wood will expand and contract with moisture changes, and that's going to differ depending on the direction of the grain in that particular case. So when we look at the longitudinal direction, which is from the roots to the top of the tree, the change in dimensions in terms of moisture changes really is not that significant. And so we can almost ignore that. I know for kiln drying, that may be a little bit different. But for woodworking, we can pretty much ignore that. When we look at the movement of wood from say the center of the tree to the outside of the tree, looking at the ring of the tree itself, we can kind of say it moves by an amount called X. And that X is going to differ between which species of wood that you cut. Also, that's going to depend on where that tree has grown. Has it grown in an environment where it grows slow, or has it grown in an environment where it grows faster? And in that case, wood grown down south can change differently in terms of movement, even for the same species, such as, say, poplar grown down south versus grown up north. And so that will change that. So we'll call that X. Now, when we look at the tangential direction, which is around the log area, that's going to move about 2x. And that's why logs will tend to split over time as they they dry faster on the outside or move more on the outside than they do on the inside, and so they'll tend to want to split in that particular case. So why does that matter? Well, one of the things we want to be cognizant of in terms of when we glue things together, if say I've got boards that are 10% moisture content and then I've glued 6% moisture content together, eventually what will occur is what we call they will equilibrate. So they will all get to that same moisture content eventually. Now it may not be in your shop, but it may be the person that you've sold that to or as a gift to somebody else, right? And so what will eventually happen is that middle board, which was at 10%, will now be smaller. This is most noticeable for, say, tabletops. If I have a tabletop that I've made, that one board, when I first made it, it is smooth and clean, but then after a few months, I see the reflection from the window down the table, and one of those boards seems to be a little smaller. This is what is occurring. Okay, the other thing that we want to look out for is what are called sunken glue joints. In this particular case, I'm gluing up with a water-based adhesive, and so the glue lines are going to swell. So the wood is going to swell right along the glue lines. If I take it and plane it down or sand it down before the wood has a chance to equilibrate back, I will have sanded off swollen wood, which will then eventually shrink. The problem is PVAs do not shrink. And so what you're going to find is you're going to find a little ridge that you're going to feel over the glue line. And we'll get calls about this a lot, and they'll tell me, your glue is extruding from the glue line. And my statement is, really? How much pressure do you have on it? And normally you'll hear them say, call me stupid or I'm an idiot, because it's a tabletop and they don't have any pressure on it. And my statement back to them usually is, well, how do you get a glue? And everybody's tried to scrape off dried glue, right? Pretty hard, pretty tough plastic, right? How do you get a plastic that is very hard to extrude from a glue line without putting any pressure on it? Again, if you have, please call me. You have violated the laws of physics, and we will be rich. Guarantee it. So what happens is you've made a depression in the wood, and your finger can feel that. That glue is going to be right on that surface that you have sanded it off, because the glue does not expand and contract with moisture. Now, if you went with a hide glues do expand and contract with moisture, and would be less felt in that particular case. Now, if you're on the coast with high moisture, that table might fall apart with hide glue, but just know that you won't have the glue lines. Now, what can also occur, you get kind of the same thing, and this is more, if you look right there, I've got kind of a plain sawn board. And again, so with a plain sawn board, if we look at the movement of that board really, in that particular case, the tangential direction is going to be along the grain lines. And so that wood is going to shrink in width more than it's going to in thickness, right? If I had rift sawn or quarter sawn boards where the grain is going up and down, that's where I'm going to see a lot of movement. So again, we want to be cognizant of the type of wood, the grain structure in that in terms of this. But this can happen normally during a seasonal cycle, right? So we sell a lot of glue around the country. Minnesota. So Minnesota can get pretty humid in the summers. And then in the winter, when it's minus 40 out and you're heating that air, bringing that into your house, heating it, you can get somewhere down around 2% moisture content in your furniture versus, say, 10% in the summer. And so you'll see a lot of movement in that wood. So in some cases, you may feel glue lines in the winter, but then they will disappear in the summer. Do we have any segmented turners in the group? Anybody? So, and you guys have felt this. I guarantee you have. You've turned your projects. They feel, they've got that baby smoothness, right? After you first sand, that final sanding, right? Just before you're going to put the oil on, you put the oil on, and it's just got that feel, right? I mean, nobody understands that as much as a turner understands what that feels like. But then, because this is a very pretty vase that you've made, and you want to show it off, And the person comes in about 3 months later and you go, let me show you this face. This face feels crinkly. Right? So it doesn't have that feel. And this is really what's going on, right? So as that dries and as it swells, those lines may become visible or have a certain touch to them. So just note that this is not an issue with the glue unless you note that the glue doesn't expand and contract with the wood. So just a note on that. And then we've talked about the different moisture changes. The other thing that we want to talk about is what's in the wood itself, right? So in a lot of cases, say a tree is growing in the forest and an amount of termites moves into the neighborhood, right? They can't put a for sale sign up and then move out of the neighborhood, right, in that particular case. They're stuck there. So what trees do is they are very good at chemical warfare, right? And so the trees will produce oils, they'll produce tannic acids, they'll produce other chemicals in the wood to keep them being a food source. So what I want to do, and maybe dispel some of the rumors, is that wood glues bond to cellulose. They do not bond mechanically into the pores of the wood. Because, and I can, once I tell you this, you'll kind of hit your head and go. So if wood glues bonded be through the pores of the wood, what would be your strongest bond? End grain to end grain, correct? Most pores. But that tends to be the weakest. And the reason it's the weakest is because there's not a lot of cellulose for the glue to bond to. And let's take a look at cellulose. And I told you I was a chemist, so I get to bore you with a little bit of chemistry. So this is basically how it works. These are sugars. They're just glucose molecules that are hooked up into long chains called polymers. This polymer has a bunch of hydroxyl groups, and there's oxygens and hydrogens. The reason we're interested in these oxygens tend to love electrons. They want electrons, and so they're going to pull it out of that hydrogen. And then the hydrogen is like, I don't want it, you can have it, and that's fine. What happens is it gets a net positive charge on the hydrogen group and a net negative charge on the oxygen group, and what we have are would be considered little neodymium magnets. Okay? These little neodymium magnets love to bond together, and so in cellulose, you'll get the hydrogens kind of hooking up with the oxygens, and the oxygens hooking up with the hydrogens. And like little magnets, the closer that they can get together, and with how cellulose is hooked, the glucose bonds are hooked together, they can get very close together. And so they form a very, very strong bond. A little bit different from, say, a starch molecule, which is also glucose, but they're hooked a little bit differently. They don't get to bond as closely, and so starches can actually be boiled and they will dissolve, where cellulose will not. And all of that is really due to the fact that the hydrogen bonding can get closer together. Very similar to, say, a neodymium magnet I put on my fridge, right? If I put that fridge right to the metal, they are very difficult to remove. But now add a couple of sheets of paper, right? The further away from that metal makes it easier to remove. And this is the process that is going on for cellulose. So why is that important? Well, for gluing, I need to have clean wood cellulosic surfaces that will give my wood glues, which also have hydroxyl groups on there, and we'll kind of go through that a little bit later. But those hydroxyl groups in the glue bond to the hydroxyl groups that are on the cellulose, and that's what causes it to have strong bonds. Side grain has a lot of cellulose, a lot of bonding sites, a lot of magnets, similar to I put one magnet on the fridge, I can pull it off. If I put 1,000 on there, I'm going to pull the door off. Same concept. Exact same concept. So, but because woods can have oily content to them, oils, tannic acids, and other things, those will protect the cellulose just like they do from insects, but it will also protect it from the glue. Has anybody here glued up Ipe? Anybody? On the internet, they'll say a lot, you can't glue Ipe. It's not going to hold together. And in most cases, they are correct unless you get the oil off. So you can get the oil off. Usually we recommend acetone. Acetone is VOC compliant here, even here in California. And works great for any oil or tannic acid that the trees produce. It evaporates pretty quickly, so what we recommend is you take a white rag, wipe the wood, look at it. If it's still got that yellow color to it, move to a cleaner place on the white rag, put some more down, right? And with acetone, since it evaporates so quickly, you want to do that, move it on the rag quite a bit. And if you're working with Ipe, you'll give up well before all the oil is out of the wood, and you're just going to glue it up anyway, right? So note that if you haven't gotten all the oil off, you're not going to get 100% of the bond. But in most cases, the Ipe is very dense and has a lot of cellulose to it. You'll get a pretty good bond. But again, you're going to have to wipe that. Certain cedars, old growth cedars, same thing. Sometimes you do, sometimes you don't, right? So we would get people calling us. I have been gluing up for 30 years and have never had a problem, which he needs more projects because I glue all the time and I have problems. But so we'll get a person who, they'll call, they'll say, your glue sucks. I just bought a new bottle and this one failed, and I've been using this bottle over here and that's not failed me. He hasn't told me also that he just bought a whole bunch of new wood also, right? And so what can happen is that tree over there who grew up under stressful conditions will make a lot more oil, more tannic acids than say this tree over here. And so in some cases you'll buy a log of this material and it's going to be harder to glue. And it may just be that it has more oil, more tannic acid. Or the other thing that can happen is burnishing. So if your tools are dull, what can happen is you can burn the wood. And when you burnish wood, what you're doing is you're burning off those hydroxyl groups. And you're ending up with what's called a carbon char. Okay? That carbon char does not have hydroxyl groups for me to bond to. And so the glue the joint that you're going to get from that is going to be weak. Now it doesn't have to be burned, doesn't have to look brown and nasty for it to break. It can just have that shiny surface on it. Because the glue does not bond through the pores of the wood, right? It glues to the surface of the wood, and if the surface of the wood doesn't have those hydroxyl groups available for bonding, you're going to get a weaker bond. Now, my statement to you is, so what? Right? In a lot of cases, it may be strong enough for your project anyway, right? But if you're finding, so how I kind of put it is, I'm not here to change what you guys do. I mean, if your glue up and your gluing and all that is working fine for you, don't change anything. That's not what I'm here for. What I'm saying is, if you're running into problems, and you can call the 800 number, tell me my glue sucks, but we'll talk about it. Right? Because there's something going on that is not the glue, and I can guarantee that. And if you tell me the truth, we can figure it out.
Can you give us some more examples of woods that are particularly oily and consequently problematic? A lot of our members use olive, a lot of them use teak.
Yeah, I've got a list here of pretty much all of those. So Behnke, bulletwood, kookaburra, kumaru, all of these are going to have some issues with that. So you just want to make sure that if you're getting weak bonds, maybe it's just the wood needs to be cleaned.
Can we get this presentation?
Yeah, just let me know. I'll send a copy of that.
Okay.
Yeah. As a matter of fact, if you're taping this or something, you're welcome to put it on your website. Anything I send you guys, any pictures that you get of anything, more than happy to put it on your website. Our job is to educate. It's not to keep information that we want. This information is available anytime. That's why you have that 800 number. If you've got any questions, you can call. Our company reaches out to woodworking groups for that very reason. We want to make sure that you understand what'll happen is you'll get a better, a better glue up, which will make you feel better about your stuff.
Is the solution the same on all of these? Because as I've read through, they're pretty much saying similar items, which is oil, some oil, high oil.
Yeah.
So is the solution the same thing, which is the...
Wipe with acetone, white rag until the rag comes back clean. So that stuff's going to look nasty. And so, like with Ipe, I mean, I took 45, I did a desktop. I mean, wonderful wood. I mean, that stuff is dent-free after my kids have had it for a good 7 years. No dents in it whatsoever. But it is a pain in the butt to clean. After 45 minutes, I gave up. I glued it up anyway. It still has held together. Again, is it strong enough for what I needed to do? It's sitting as a desktop, or a tabletop. Yeah, fine.
Chemical question. You were referring to hydroxyl stretch bonds or the hydroxyl groups and how they bind together. In water, when it polymerizes to make ice, you have something called a hydrogen bond. Are you getting
Right.
hydrogen bonding?
It's hydrogen bonding. Yeah, it's that same.
Repeat the question.
Oh, okay. So he was talking about when water freezes, the water, which has got a lot of oxygen, hydrogen to it, they kind of ionically kind of crystallize for ice. And it's the same kind of process that does occur. So we want to make sure that they can get that close together and remove anything that's going to get in the way. The other thing that can occur is called black glue lines. I don't know if some people may have run into that, where you glue something up and the glue lines just turn black. What that is it's certain woods will pick up iron from the soil. Has anybody here taken steel wool and vinegar to make a dye? Okay, so it's iron acetate, basically. So vinyl acetate glues, that acetate portion, can hydrolyze off over time. All PVAs will do that. That's why they are not considered archival glues, because they will release acetic acid over time, small amounts. And so that acetic acid, if there is any iron in the wood, it's going to cause those glue lines to turn black. And I can guarantee you, if your glue has turned black, there's iron somewhere. Now, I don't know where. I had a guy call once. We talked for an hour trying to figure out where this iron could be coming from. And what we determined was that he had used that sandpaper to sand off his, some rust off of his table saw pad. And so then he sanded that. And that's where the iron came from. So again, if it's turning black, if you call me, my statement's going to be, I don't know. But we'll talk about it. We'll try and figure out. If you call me, I can't tell you what went wrong. What I can tell you, though, is what to look for in terms of what could have gone wrong. Okay?
One more question, going back to the oily woods. What glue that you...
So the question is, what glue would you use for oily woods? Yeah. In a lot of cases, if you've cleaned it, doesn't matter. It's cellulose, and that's what these glues are wanted to bind to. Some of the polyurethane glues will glue to the tannins or the lignins in there, and so you can get a little bit different. But again, for the most part, you're going to have to clean the oils off for the glues, any adhesive, to really stick well. Okay?
Another question.
Yeah.
What is the water content of the glue, and what benefits or detriments are there to diluting it or applying?
So the question is, how much water is in the glues, and can I dilute it? Probably to make it thinner in some cases. So most of the wood glues that we have are around 50% solids. Some will go as low as 45, but anything kind of lower than that 45 tends to not give enough glue to there, and you end up with what we would consider a starved kind of glue joint in that particular case. And so all of our wood glues, you can add 5% water without hurting the strength of the wood. Then every 5% you add after that tends to reduce the strength by 10 to 15%. adding that 5% will usually reduce the viscosity by 25 to 50%. So be cognizant of that. Question?
Since we're on the subject of adding water, what do you think about term glue sizing, where you water down the first layer of glue, but then tack, and then put a stronger layer of glue before joining the two pieces?
So I'm assuming, so we're talking about sizing the wood before putting glue on to glue up a joint. I'm assuming you're considering end grain in this particular case, which is what that comes up mostly for. So we did some testing in our lab. What is the best way to bond end grain to end grain? What we found was just put enough glue on. The problem with gluing end grain is sometimes that glue will pull the glue down the ends of the straws, so to speak, and you'll end up with a starved glue joint. So sizing does help that, but the problem with sizing is what we found was it doesn't work as well as just put a gobs of glue on, press it in with your finger on both sides, then glue it together. That's going to be your strongest in that particular case. There's no reason to do that sizing, just get enough glue on there. And we found on end grain that the thicker that glue line is, the stronger that bond is. And I don't know if anybody's ever used our Quick and Thick. It comes in a silver bottle. That tends to work very well on end grain. It was our old miter molding and trim glue. That's one of our sales guys, so he's here to help. So, yeah. So the best way is just get enough glue on those joints. So.
Further along the line of diluting glue, do you have a recommendation if you're doing like a glue size as a finishing step in terms of
Okay, so yeah. So the question is, if I'm going to, and I know maple and some of the other ones cherry do better with a sizing on it, and you can use the PVAs as a sizing for that. Typically, we recommend 50-50 with water.
any particular product?
Any of them will work. Again, all you're doing in this particular case is filling those pores, so that, because with maple and cherry, some of those pores are very absorbent, some are not, and you want to, make them more equal along the face of the board. And so really you're just getting some of those particles, and again, we'll get to some of that may make sense. Okay? So let's talk a little bit about gluing. So edge gluing and face gluing, right? So in this particular case, one of the things that we want to talk about is clamping. So when you clamp something up, what you get is where that clamp touches the wood, we're going to get what's called a cone of force from that. Normally we can think of that as 45 degrees in each direction. The stiffer the wood, obviously that angle is going to come out. The more bendy the wood is, that angle is going to come down, but we can pretty much think about 45. We want to overlap those so that you have force on there. And one of the things that it's easy to kind of think about and see is, okay, so let's say I have a veneer on a piece of wood, and I clamp it every, quote, 4 inches, right? In between there's not going to be enough clamping force on that veneer to keep it clamped down, and so you're going to get waviness in there. As the wood soaks up moisture out of the glue, it's going to want to warp and twist, right? So what clamping is for is just to hold the wood into the position that you want it to have after the glue dries. And that's it. So we had, with a veneer, that's why you put a coal, thank you, on that, just to spread that force out, okay? So the question that we come up with then is, what kind of force? So we had a gentleman call us one time, and it started with your glue sucks. Actually, it wasn't so much that my glue sucked, it was he was a little confused because we say that our glue will hold very tightly, and he had jatoba, which is one of the harder woods out there. Brazilian cherry, I believe, right? Rosewood, one of those. So it was jatoba, very hard wood. And he used our suggested clamping force. So we suggest that on softer woods you use 100 psi. For medium density like maple we use 150. For high density woods about 150 to 200. And he did that and his fell apart. So we had talked for a long time over the phone, and I had him send us some of the wood and we did some testing. So what we did was we tested clamping pressure with a 5-pound weight. And that 5-pound weight on the samples worked out to be about 0.6 pounds per square inch clamping pressure. Then we did our recommended clamping pressure, and then we went up to 1,000 psi. And there was a paper out in 1998 that said you could go up to 1,000 psi without losing any strength. So what we also did was we tested poplar, which is a very soft wood. We tested maple, which is a medium density, and then we tested his jatoba. What we found was that in every single case, the 5-pound weight made the strongest bond. Absolutely. But it varied with the hardness of the wood. And so the poplar, between the 5-pound weight and the 1,000 psi, really lost about 15% bond strength. The maple, as you went up from that 5 to the 1,000, lost about 25 to 30%. The jatoba lost 50 to 100%. So what we've come to recommend now is utilize the least amount of force to clamp your products into the position they need to be for your project. Now, the problem comes in is if your joinery is like mine, which is pretty bad, I tend to have to clamp it a little bit harder in some cases than I really would like to, because I'm forcing the wood into a position that it doesn't want to be in. And that kind of makes sense, right? Better joinery tends to make stronger bonds, right? And so, again, as we go through this stuff, it kind of makes sense. What we believe is happening under those high forces is similar to what happens with epoxies when you glue them and put pressure on them. And those bonds will just basically fall apart. It's because we believe that you're starving the glue joint of glue. Because wood has a natural tendency to want to move. And if it cannot move, if you've put it in too tightly, it's going to move anyway, right? And so the thicker the glue line, the more movement that the wood can do without forcing it out. It's similar to like a sealant. Let's say I put a sealant in a joint that moves. If my joint moves, say, 1/8 of an inch, and I start with 1/8 of an inch joint, it's going to pull that joint apart, right? And so, but if I make that joint 1/4 of an inch or 1/2 inch, and I've got that 1/8 of an inch joint, there's plenty of movement to allow the glue or the sealant to stay there without forcing the sealant either to break itself or to lose adhesion off of the one side or pull the glue off of the one side or the sealant. And so that's what we believe in, and we'll show a slide on a re-gluing where the thicker glue lines actually do give you a little more strength. Question?
On that edge gluing, the controversy between using biscuit and dominoes as either alignment tools or do they add any structure to the joint?
I've got a slide to talk about dominoes and biscuits and dowels. So hold that thought. So now the fun part of this presentation is how does glue dry? So excited.
I watch it all the time.
I know, right? Who wouldn't love this stuff? But anyway, so this is a picture of what Titebond glues look like under a microscope. This is it. Not complicated, little balls of plastic that float in water. The key to this is actually the outside of the particles. I will tell you, polyvinyl acetate as a polymer does not stick to wood. So PVAs don't stick to wood. What sticks to the wood is what's on the outside, what we stabilize these particles with, which is polyvinyl alcohol. And the alcohol has a ton of hydroxyl groups on it, and that's what sticks to the wood. Okay? Again, all that happens, again, not rocket science. They're far apart, then they get closer and closer and closer together until they touch. So everybody's taken wood glue between their fingers, very slippery, right, initially? Then all of a sudden, it'll start to putty up on you, right? If you took that glue at that point in time, once it's puttied up, rubbed it on the wood, clamped it together, it would not bond the wood. It would not bond the wood because the glue has to flow onto the surface, and those hydroxyl groups have to get very close together. If it doesn't flow, it will stay on the surface of that and won't flow into the intimate little chambers of the structure of the wood itself. Okay?
Question I think applies here. When I'm doing segmented pieces and it's all end grain going around, and you do a slip joint where you're
A rub joint?
together and all of a sudden it starts to get the friction and hold, what's happening in that?
So in that particular case, so he's talking about what we call a rub joint. So basically you rub the joint together until you feel it catch. At that point, what's happening is you have just gotten to the putty point of the glue, right? So the glue has gotten to the putty point. Now, if you kept rubbing it from then and just kept trying to rub it, once it's past its putty point, it'll get to a point where it won't stick together anymore because the glue can't flow together. Now, as you get to that putty point, those particles don't want to slip past each other as easily. There's less water as the water, gets soaked into the wood, right? And so you'll get to that point right where you leave it set. And there, it won't have to dry any further. And what happens is, because it's not going to shrink much further, you actually don't have to clamp that. So those joints can get pretty strong. And in a lot of cases, they tend to be thicker, and so they tend to be tougher joints also. So clamping is not necessary if your joinery fits very well, right? So you can do a rub joint, and they're very... So let's talk about the putty point. At what point, if I've got a jar full of marbles, which are the particles, theoretical particles, how much water can I still fit in that jar? And that works out to be about 33%. Okay? So when we look at wood glues, which are 50% solids, we're looking at only 17% water that has to disappear from the glue before it starts to set. Now, the glue that I handed out to you guys, or that got handed out today, that glue is our speed set, and it's a 60% solid wood glue. And that's why it sets very fast. You only have 7% water to play with, right? And so it's very critical that you understand that process and the type of glue that you're using in terms of that. Now, what we give each of the glues is what's called an open time and a total assembly time. What's happening during the open time is you put the glue on the wood, right? And everybody's put the glue on the wood and felt it just get draggy right away, right? Well, what's happening there is, as soon as that glue hits the wood, you are forming a layer of glue that's already cured. It may just be a couple of those polymer particles thick, right, the particles. But as the wood soaks the moisture out, I'll get layer and layer and layer. What we need to have for a good glue is to have glue that will flow between the two glue pieces. That's it. That's all we're looking for. We only need one layer that is still fluid. That's all we need, right? So initially, you've got the wood sucking the moisture out of the glue, and you also have the air evaporating water out of the glue, right? So if I'm gluing up in very dry conditions, what we state as our recommended working time can be much smaller. If you're working under very humid conditions, that may be much longer, right? The other part is, it's called the total assembly time, and that is where, when you put your pieces together, you do have to clamp them at some point, unless you're doing a rub joint. Who here can clamp something together without it moving? And when I say movement, all it has to do is move half of one of those particles, right? Which means you'd have to clamp it without it moving half of a micron. So no one can do it, right? So if your glue has gotten past that putty point while you're clamping it together, it's going to move and the glue will not be able to flow back together. It will not be able to, how would you say, remove the air which you've just introduced into the glue line. Okay? That air will cause a layer, what is called of foam. Basically, air and polymer mixed together. Foams are always very weak. Let's say, let's talk a little bit about polyurethane glue, right? So polyurethane glue, when it cures, and it's 100% solids, but it cures. It's a liquid initially because it's a low molecular weight. That low molecular weight links together as it gets in contact with moisture. It will release carbon dioxide during that reaction, which is what causes the polyurethane glues to foam. Okay? If you don't clamp a polyurethane glue tightly, what will happen is that foam will spread the pieces out. You'll end up with a glue that's only about 30 psi in strength. Whereas properly clamped, without the foam in the joint, you'll end up with about 3,000 psi. Right? So again, we want to make sure we don't introduce air into that glue line, which is going to cause it to be weaker. So what's the best? Single-sided or two-sided? Let me see hands that are single-sided gluers. Okay? Two-sided gluers, raise your hand. What I will tell you guys, you are all correct. But there are advantages and disadvantages to each method. If you want invisible glue lines, you have to be a single-sided gluer. And the reason for that is, as soon as you put the glue on the wood, you are forming a glue line. If you put it on two sides, you're forming two glue lines. And not only that, but you're taking longer between them. And so, again, you're going to get a thicker glue line once you put it together. You will always see a two-sided glue line, always. And as a two-sided gluer, you're using twice as much glue, and we thank you. Tremendously. Not only that, but you're going to get a lot of squeeze out, which doesn't help you, but helps us. So, but as a two-sided gluer, you are having more glue that is typically going to be in a liquid state, and so your chances of success of wetting the glue out on part A, wetting the glue out on part B, and still having glue wet in the middle is going to be much higher. Okay? If you're a single-sided gluer, you better get an egg timer and you better be fast. Question?
I have a question about the putty state. If you reach the putty state, if you were to introduce that 17% additional liquid in it, get it back into that fluid state, can you do that?
So the question is, I've gotten to the putty state. And I had to kind of tear it apart because it can be a little difficult once that starts to putty up to get those pieces apart. Can I put a little more glue on and put it together? Or spritz a little water? Yes. But my question is if it's gone too far past and those particles are stuck together, that water's not going to, break up as easily. So those particles are glue. They love to stick together, right? And we'll go through a little bit in terms of its freeze-thaw stability. What happens during freeze-thaw? Probably not that important here, but obviously Minnesota, very important. Or we're shipping from Ohio, and so if it shows up frozen, there could be issues with that. But those particles like to stick together. So if I just spritz water in and just put them together, I may just have a layer of water, right? I've got to be able to get them mixed to break those particles up to get them to flow again. So again, putting another layer of glue, thin layer of glue, probably better in that particular case. Question?
So your Titebond 3, which is supposed to be like a waterproof type
Yes.
glue, is that similar?
So that would be similar. So the water resistance of the glue doesn't come into effect until the glue has a chance to fully dry. So it is a secondary chemical reaction that occurs, and it's N-methylolacrylamide with melamine resin added to that. So again, you probably don't care about that, but what it is the drying process for Titebond 3 is no different from Titebond original or any of the other ones. That drying process occurs. The water resistant portion of that occurs after it's fully dry. Okay?
Okay, so talking
Question?
about the blue line here.
Okay?
A lot of people use the rule of thumb, talked about how much pressure. You didn't really give too much quantitative advice about that, but so is it reasonable to assume the old adage that if you get just squeeze out, you've got a good bond?
So the squeeze out portion, so the question is just because you got squeeze out, is it a good bond? And my statement is, not really. However, if I do get squeezed out, I do know that I've wet both sides out, right? I've got enough glue in there to wet both sides of that wood. If I get no squeeze out, I still may get a good bond. I just don't know if I've got it at the maximum strength that bond's going to have. But in a lot of cases, you may not need the maximum strength. Right. So in a lot of cases, my question back to you is, I don't know. What's it going to be used for? If you're making a chair that's going to see a lot of racking, probably you want good squeeze out. If you're making a tabletop, the only reason you need the squeeze out is so you don't get, blank spots where there's no glue, and so now there's a hole there, which is going to take stain a bit differently. So again, it's going to depend.
What about scraping or wiping with water on that glue, on that squeeze?
So
Gel and scrape it?
yeah, the question is what's the best way, and I've got a slide on that. So again, I know he has no questions. They're good questions. So.
Back later.
Yeah, I like him. He's funny. Salt. So in that particular case, you can put salt in a glue line to keep the slippage down. If you're using a water-resistant glue that you need to be water-resistant, putting a water-soluble salt inside of that bond may not be the best. But what we found is it won't hurt the strength. Okay?
So real quickly, you were talking about the slippage, and I just realized, so let's say I'm making a cutting board, which I make, and I put them all in the clamps, and I tighten it down just a little bit, and then I usually take a mallet or something, a straight edge, to put them all close together, so I have a fairly, make sure that I've got fairly 90 degrees. Is that actually hurting the bond when I take and start sliding them together after I've already put just a little pressure on them?
Yeah, so the question is once I clamp them together, how much movement can I put on them to not hurt the glue line? And my question is, I don't know. And the reason I don't know.
I just want to know, should I not be doing?
Well, no. So here's my answer to you. It's going to depend on how close to the putty point that glue is at that point. I won't know that. I don't know how long it's took you. I don't know what the moisture content of the wood is. I don't know what your humidity is. A lot of things. So there is a way to get an infinite amount of assembly time. If you moisten the joints with water beforehand, get them above that 17% moisture content, that wood is not going to soak up any water out of the glue. If this is my gluing area and I put a ultrasonic humidifier and blow humidity over my glue up area, it's 100% relative humidity over my table, it's not going to evaporate into the air. It'll never dry. But note that once I get it out of there and set it aside and clamp it, it's got so much moisture in the glue lines, it's going to take longer for that to dry. Again, you're going to ask me how long that's going to be. I'm going to say, I don't know. It's going to depend on your environmental conditions that you have. And that's why some of this is a little bit art, some of this is a little bit science, right? If I wanted to get so ingrained to find what that science is, yeah, I could tell you exactly. But in a lot of cases from over the phone, I'm going to just say, I don't know. You'll have to kind of figure. And if you're ever unsure about something, just put some scrap pieces together, right? And wait for a certain period of time. Handle it the same way you would with your glue up, and then just break them with a hammer. At some point in time, it'll be dry enough that you're going to get wood failure. At that time, I'd say unclamp it. So again, if there are ways of figuring this out.
Well,
I mean, you can.
Water and then glue, and then with your finger put some water on both sides and glue it, and then as you go along,
Yeah.
and then press it all together.
So you can add that and do that and kind of be assured that you're going to have wet glue, but the problem is, do you want to let it in the clamps for 3 weeks for that all to dry up enough? Again, I don't know how thick your boards are. How long would it take to air dry a 4/4 board? Right, that I've just glued up and I've got glue in the middle of that. So I don't know. In a lot of cases, it's pretty long. I mean, it's going to dry pretty fast around the edges, right? And so it's going to hold it together, right? Because most of the stress is going to be on the outside of those bonds, right? Middle contributes what, 20 to 30%, so to speak. But I've got a lot of water in the middle of that board along the glue lines.
But you don't have to clamp it though, because it's already been sealed, as you mentioned earlier, the clamping's not necessary because it's already all lined up, right?
Right, as long as it's aligned in the position that it's going to be, and it's drying long enough for the glue to get to the strength it needs to hold it in place for the handling that it's going to see next, right? So if I'm then going to drill press it, you know, I'm putting pressure in the middle of that board. If that glue line is only this thick, that's dried versus, you know, because it's on the outside, as I push down on that drill press, it may pop it, right? So again, I don't know. So what I have found is the more water that you put in a project, the less quality you're going to have. Because in a lot of cases, that glue line isn't going to shrink down for a while, right? Kind of the same thing, and we're going to get into this a little bit. Let's say I've got biscuits, right? I'm making a nice big tabletop. Or dominoes, and I'm gluing them all in, right? I'm putting a ton of glue in them and putting them in there and to get it all put together, right? I've just put a lot of water in the middle of that board. And now I'm going to sand it, but then over time that tabletop is going to dry out. I have seen sunk holes where all the dominoes were on a tabletop because they sanded it before the wood has had a chance to equilibrate. Right? So again, thicker the table, the longer that's going to take. Right? So how long is a 4/4 tabletop going to take to dry? Somebody air dry wood, 4/4. A year to 2, right? I mean, depending. Yeah. So it could take a while before you can really do your final finish, final sanding, because you don't want it moving later.
In that same aspect, some guys say, if it sets up for an hour, it's good to leave it dry by itself for the day.
So clamp time,
24 hours.
right? So clamp time. You're going to ask me what my clamp time is. If you want to guarantee, I'm going to say 24 hours at least, right? Because I don't know what your joinery looks like. I mean, if you're trying to clamp two.
Personal.
I don't care who you are. That's funny right there. So, I mean, if your boards that you're gluing together were like this, right, instead of perfectly flat, that's going to be a lot more force that I'm going to have to overcome with glue than, say, something that is flat. So I'm going to need to clamp those boards that are warped much longer until the wood glue gets to be strong enough. So when we look at wood glue, right, so at 0 time, it's going to have 0 strength, right? As time goes by and we're looking at strength, it's going to follow a curve that looks like that, right? At some point in time along this curve, it's going to be strong enough. Titebond 2 sets very fast. I've seen people take it out of the clamps in 15 minutes. But I'm going to tell you, I'm not going to guarantee that, right? But I've seen people do it. This speed set, people take it out of the clamps in 5 minutes. So for segmented turning, this is wonderful for putting rings together. You can start turning that right away. But again, what I'll say about segmented turning is, I've just put some water in that glue line, and I'm going to turn it, right? I wouldn't do my final sanding until it's fully dry.
You may get to it later on the wafers,
Dominoes?
either
Biscuits?
Biscuits. Besides alignment, does it help with strength at all in joints?
So let me ask a question. So if I take two boards and just glue them together, and then I stress and break them along the glue line, am I going to get wood failure?
I've tried that and breaks the wood every time.
Every time. So what I'm going to say is, if I take a domino or a biscuit and I cut wood, I actually cut some wood out of there.
It decreases strength.
In a lot of cases, it actually decreases the strength. But again, for alignment purposes, if you can get those bonds together faster and make sure that your glue is not going to get to its putty point, I'm all for it. And in a lot of cases, you don't need that extra strength in a lot of the projects you're doing anyway.
Do you have an opinion on the practice of kind of a complementary jointing to some of the alliance boards, just in case you don't really get
Right.
90 degrees or
Yeah, you always, yeah,
good idea or bad?
no, great idea. Great idea. Again, the better your joinery, the stronger your bonds.
Can you rephrase the question so I understand what it is?
So in a lot of cases, let's say my joiner isn't exactly 90, right? So this board I do in this direction, and the other board I do in the other direction. Then when I flip them, they have complementary angles. Yeah, they're going to be 180 degrees, right? Okay. So let's talk a little bit about mortise and tenons. Probably one of the most difficult joints to bond. Difficult. In a lot of these cases, they're put in chairs, and they see a lot of racking forces. So there's a lot of force typically. That's why you choose a mortise and tenon joint, is because those joints are going to see a lot of stress. All right, so let's say I have a mortise and tenon joint I have just cut perfectly. I put it together, I got to hammer it down in, right? I guarantee you I can glue that together with water and you're not going to get it apart, correct? Correct? Until it dries back out. Right? And so my question is let's say I'm using a water-based wood glue on a nice, tight-fitting mortise and tenon joint. Put the glue on the mortise, put the glue on the tenon, and then I got 4 of those that I'm putting together, maybe 8, depending on what I'm doing. So the wood has a lot of time to move. Then I take that, and now that instead of just light tapping to get it together, now I got to hammer it together. I've squeezed off all the glue, but it sure fits tightly. Is that a well-glued joint? Probably not. Probably not. And that's why what I see is most of the calls that we get for repair tend to be mortise and tenon joints. Now let's say my joints don't fit quite as well together, and I put glue in there, right? And they go together pretty well because they've swollen a little bit and they fit a lot better than that dry fit did, right? Now that feels pretty good, and that dry glue is going to dry. Well, the problem with using a water-based wood glue for a loose-fitting joint is that the glue is 50% solids. It's going to shrink. So at some point in time in there, since I can't create matter, glue is only small g, not big G, it can't create matter. So as it shrinks, it's going to gap, right? As a mortise and tenon joint, any movement in there is going to cause wood fiber to tear. Then more fiber to tear, more fiber to tear, until it gives up the ghost. So again, in a lot of cases, water-based wood glues may not be the best for a mortise and tenon joint. In a lot of cases, I would say make them a tiny bit, maybe a 64th to maybe less than that, small, so that they fit together very well, and use an epoxy. An epoxy will not shrink as it dries, will stay the same size, will support the joint all the way. The only issue with an epoxy is you can't really clamp them very hard, so a really tight-fitting joint is not going to hold together all that well, even with an epoxy in that case. Really, with a very tight-fitting mortise and tenon joint, pinning them sometimes, but just note that gluing them with that wood movement can be a little bit difficult to understand, right, to see. The other thing, let's talk about dovetails. I've seen videos of people putting glue on every single little put pin, tail, four of them, putting it together. And he was using Titebond too, and I'm like, that's dry. You're putting it together, that glue's already dry on that first one you've just glued together. But with a dovetail joint, it's mechanically locked, correct? Especially if you get your pins and tails in the right position. Don't ask. So in most cases, all of that stress is going to be mechanically locked. The only thing the glue is doing is when your kids put too many socks in the drawer, can't close it, and they're shoving it down, it keeps the sides from popping out, right? That's all the glue has to do. In a lot of cases, one drop of glue on each one of those pins or tails put together is going to be sufficient for that joint in a lot of cases, correct? So what I'm trying to get you guys to think about here is, what is the glue doing, right? Are you spending too much time in a lot of cases trying to get 100% coverage of glue when you really don't necessarily need it in a lot of cases? Now, let's talk about miters. I mean, in the case of miters, tend to be a little bit weaker, right? I wouldn't make a chair out of all miter joints because they're weak. But in most cases, we're doing stuff with miters that don't require a lot of stress. And so therefore, glue them up, put them together. You're mostly worried about, do they fit well? And that's okay. Using a thicker glue, such as the Quick and Thick, and I think you get that at Lowe's, right, in their stores, great for miters. It's thick enough so that you don't starve the joint because the glue is so thick it doesn't dive down the end grain, and gives you a relatively thick glue because there's a bit of movement. Just note that on a joint, right, your wood is moving like this, right, in those cases. So that joint is seeing a lot of differential forces. So you need a bit of glue in there to allow for some movement in there. Question?
With a thicker glue, is it just more solids?
So the Quick and Thick is about 60%. So it's the same as that bottle that you got. It's just that what I would call this is quick and thin. If you put that on end grain, it's so thin it would probably disappear down the end grains. It's so thin that you'd have to really get a lot in there. That Quick and Thick is designed for getting a lot of glue there. In a lot of cases, it's also a very flexible glue. And so let's say I'm putting a piece of trim on the side of a cabinet. That cabinet's going to see a lot of movement this way, wide. That trim piece that I'm going to put on is going to see absolutely no movement because that's in the longitudinal direction, right? And so, but this glue is designed so that that piece, which isn't going to move, and this is going to move like that, that glue will move with the wood. It's soft and flexible. So it's designed for molding pieces, designed for trim pieces to allow for that movement. So in that particular case, but it will get up to 3,000 PSI. Plenty strong enough for the type of molding that you're going to be putting in place. Question?
Back to tortoise and tenon real quick. So with the way you're describing the gluing, would you then recommend maybe when you're gluing up, only glue one side?
So in a lot of cases with mortise and tenon, you want to get them together as fast as you can. As fast as you can. The problem is, normally with a mortise and tenon, there's more than just the one that you're doing. And so you're going to have to put together jigs, which are going to allow you to clamp that in the final position it actually needs to be in. And that can be difficult, right? And so in a lot of cases, you can get a slow set epoxy that'll give you an hour to put them all together in that particular case. So again, this is, and we don't make an epoxy, right? So this is not an advertisement presentation. It's a presentation to get you guys to understand your projects, understand what the glue is doing, and what you can do to make it better for yourself so you don't run into those failures that you're going to call me on and tell me my glue sucks. Adjusting the time of glue up by adding water to the glue typically isn't as effective as, I mean, if you really need to, just moisten the wood. That's where most of the moisture gets sucked out of the glue. school white glue.
versus Titebond 1?
So Titebond original.
That's how, like I said,
No, we'll get to the formula in a little bit. So the issue comes in, school glue doesn't have any additives to get it to set very fast. So it's pretty slippery. I mean, for a lot of cases, it works fine. I mean, we have our own white glue also, school type glue. Works fine. Most people who are making stuff don't like it because it just does take that long to set, right? In a lot of cases, say our Titebond 2 sets very fast. Titebond 3 sets very slow. There are people out there who hate Titebond 3. Absolutely hate it, will not use it, don't put it in my shop because it takes so much longer in the clamps to set. Whereas in production, it's all about time and money, right? And we've got stuff that will set very, very fast for those particular people.
I don't expect you to give me exact numbers because each case is different, like you said, so
Right.
feel free to go, it depends. What's the relative timing, not duration-wise, difference between like a Titebond 2 and a Titebond 3 when you say slow set? Is it like
Right.
twice as long, 3 times?
Right, so what we're gonna do, again, we're gonna tell you at 8% moisture content, 70 degrees Fahrenheit, 50% relative humidity. Titebond 2 is gonna give you 5 minutes. So original and 2 are very similar, except 2's got water resistance. You're gonna get 5 minutes to put the glue on and get your parts together. Then you're gonna get another 5 minutes to maybe 10 minutes. With 2, it's more like 5 minutes. Original, you probably get away with 10 minutes to get it finally clamped. Titebond 3 is going to give you 10 minutes of time to get the glue together and your parts together, and then another 10 to 15 minutes, 20 to 25 minutes to finally get it clamped up. Titebond 3 tends to be more forgiving in that way in terms of open and total assembly time, such that people will call us and tell me that Titebond 2 sucks, but Titebond 3 is wonderful. And what I will tell you is, I get somebody who's in production, who'll be on the same call, in the other ear telling me Titebond 3 sucks, and Titebond 2 is wonderful. And so what I'll try to tell you is, use the glue that sets your speed better. If you are a production guy, you're going to be looking for 2 original, maybe even some of our super fast setting glues like you have here. If you're just a hack like me, 3 works better for, because
You need some sloth.
I need sloth glue. Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, so it's going to depend on what you guys are looking for, right? We talked about dowels, biscuits, and miters.
Shelf life for your
Okay.
sitting in the bottle.
Yeah. So I'm going to grab this.
I've opened up a bottle, but I keep it closed. What's shelf life?
So let's talk a little bit about shelf life. What I will tell you is, you guys absolutely don't care about shelf life. However, my lawyers do. Right? My lawyers do. So shelf life is the time that we're going to guarantee the glue is still usable, no matter how poorly you guys want to store it. Okay? What you're more interested in is what's the usable life of the glue, right? And so Titebond 2, original 2, 3, they all have a 2-year shelf life. Like most of our glues are going to give you a 2-year official shelf life. If you've got Titebond 2 or 3, which are reactive adhesives, and if you store them at room temperature, usable life will probably be about 4 to 5 years. If you refrigerate it, you'll get 10 years out of it. But what I will tell you is, if it's taking you 10 years to use a bottle of glue, you need more projects. You definitely need more projects. But like the Titebond original and the speed set, right? Non-reactive adhesives, usually about 10 years.
What's the best kind of glue to use for a project that will be staying outside?
So if you're using an exterior project, you're going to have to go with either 2 or 3, right? So 2 or 3. If you need more time to put it together, 3. The difference in terms of water resistance of 2 and 3 is 3 will pass a boiling water soak, whereas Titebond 2 will not. Who here boils furniture? Anybody? Actually, if you're making cutting boards, it may see a dishwasher cycle. Yeah, no. But if it does, it'll look awful, but it'll still be together with Titebond 3. 2, not so much. course, they'll say, can you reglue this? And you'll go, yes, I can. $10.
Before we go to, going back to the mortise and tenon tight fitting joints.
Yes.
What is your opinion if you were to put deep scratches on the tenon, and that would provide the glue to create joint space within the joint?
So again, it's going to depend on the fit, right? So if I squeeze it all off as I go, right. So if I've got glue in grooves, but it's not touching the other side, right? Remember, it's not a mechanical joint. It's cellulose to cellulose. Those scratches, I've got cellulose to cellulose, but it's on the same piece. Does that make sense? So, and in a lot of cases, people say, well, I've roughed it up with 80 grit sandpaper to get a better gluing surface. Problem is that if you do that, you end up with damaged fibers that you're gluing to. And yes, absolutely, when you break those apart, you get tremendous wood failure. That looks wonderful, like the glue's doing a great job. But the problem with gluing to damaged fibers is just as if you see a little hair of wood sticking off here and you pull it up, right? Just now I've got a piece that I'm gluing back on, right? The problem with gluing damaged fiber is that it'll break the fibers, along the grain structure. It'll look like I got a lot of wood failure, but the joints tend to be weaker in that particular case. So usually we'll recommend a nice planed surface, hand planed surface, wonderful. It'll get rid of any burnishing from, say, your tools that may be a little dull. Otherwise, 220 to 320 grit without burnishing. So this would be either hand sand or use your palm sander without burnishing, without building up that heat, right? So that's what we're looking for. So on these bottles is going to tell you what the manufacture date was. So if everybody's got their bottle, we can look at it. They're all going to start with the letter A, which means they're made in America. The next two digits are going to be the year. In this case, it's 23 for 2023. The next two, 04 for April. The next two, 25 for April 25th, 2023. So these are fairly new bottles. Again, this is a non-reactive, non-water resistant. So if you leave it inside, typically about 10 years worth of use. If it's very dry, water will actually evaporate through the plastic over time. You may end up having to add a little water over time to get it back to usability. But again, if we know what it looks like under a microscope, they're just little balls of plastic. If you add 5% water, that just pushes them a little further apart, allows them to move, which allows the viscosity to come down.
Great. I use a lot of your hide glue product in my mortise joints. You haven't mentioned it at all.
So the hide glue, so in dry areas, hide glue is great. I mean, it's a very old glue. Most of the furniture industry has moved away from hide glue because it doesn't have humidity resistance. And that's the thing. But hide glue, everybody's like, ooh, hide glue. Everybody here has made their own hide glue. I guarantee it. And you're looking at me like, yeah, right? So everybody's had Kentucky Fried Chicken? You have wiped your hands with a napkin. The napkin has stuck to your fingers. Congratulations, you've made chicken hide glue. That's all it is. So ours is a cowhide. Basically, you just boil the hides. You get the gravy that comes off of there, evaporate the water, you end up with that. So our liquid hide glue is 251 gram strength hot hide glue. We actually take the chips, put it in the reactor, heat it up, make hot hide glue. Then we add a urea salt to it. The urea salt, the only thing the urea salt does is it changes the gel point. So our glue is the same as hot hide glue, but instead of a gel point which is above room temperature, our gel point is now at 40 degrees. So if you're working in a shop that's under 40 degrees, our liquid hide glue will be a hot hide glue. You have to warm it above the 40 degrees and it'll act just the same. Strength-wise, they're just the same. The glues work the same way, except for they're not little particles. They're actually a soluble collagen. So it's a soluble polymer. And that's the only difference. The only thing that I don't like about them is it is not humidity resistance. But hide glue tends to shrink and swell with moisture, right? And so the drying out of the wood, as the wood dries out, the glue actually shrinks too, and so it's less of a, feeling that edge. However, if it gets to a humid area, you can make a hygrometer for your shop with hide glue, put it on a piece of paper, and as that dries, it'll shrink that paper into a nice tight curl. As the humidity goes up, that paper will uncurl. I've got one in my office. 4 years ago now, the HVAC system went out one summer, very humid. The glue actually started to run off of the paper and dripped onto the floor. So just note that glue has some issues with that. That's why the industry has moved away from it, and PVAs have taken that over. Specific question about hide glue?
No, I like to use it, because I can take it apart, ready to.
No, absolutely, and that's one of the wonderful things about it, but that's also one of the bad things about it.
Yeah, but I moved here from Wisconsin, all my furniture fell apart in the moving truck instead of the desert.
Yeah. So we do. So the extended glues, the reason I don't talk about the extended glues that much, because the Titebond 3, especially for hobbyist groups, tend to give you that same total assembly time. The extends will give you a little bit longer open time, from the 5 minutes or from 10 minutes, which Titebond 3 has, to 15 minutes. But the same clamp time is the same 20 to 25 minutes. The problem with the extends is they tend to settle, right? So the stuff we put in the extends to give it that, longer working time is clay. And the clay tends to settle to the bottom. And if you don't mix that into there, then you're just using the original anyway. So 3, we don't do it with clay, we do it with walnut shell flour, which doesn't settle. Now you'll see sometimes a bottle of 3 will have a little bit of separation to it. It'll depend on the lot of walnut shell flour. Some years they tend to be lighter. Some years they tend to be more dense, the flour does. So in some cases you'll see them settle to the bottom. Some you'll see them settle to the top. And some years you won't find any. So it really depends on that growing season for the walnut shells is what it comes down to. Mixing them. So the glue is such thick that shaking is not going to do it unless you got like a paint shaker. You got to get those particles moving to get them. And that clay tends to settle like bad paint. So my question to you is, if you had a paint can that sat around for 2 years, would shaking it mix that in? And my statement is no. You're going to have to get something to scrape that goo off the bottom and get it mixed in. And that's why I don't necessarily talk as much about the extends. They're great glues, don't get me wrong. But in a lot of cases, if you're using them and you haven't mixed them, you're not really using the extend version anyway. And so with those, you really do need to mix them. Best way to mix, I'm going to grab this again, sorry. Because these are very small openings, right? A stick twice as tall as the bottle, use that little opening as a fulcrum. That tends to mix. But remember, mixing them is not going to do it. All you'll do is swirl it around the bottom. You're going to have to pull that stuff up from the bottom, squeegee it off as you go, and get it mixed in. It can be a little time consuming. For the most part, original 2 and 3 don't settle very much over time. You will get some stratifications. We did see all of the particles before. The larger particles will tend to settle. The smaller particles will tend to be on top. And so when you go to use it, it won't be what we would say is Titebond 3, but in most cases, it's going to be fine. The larger particles will tend to be thicker, heavier, carry a little more mass than the lighter particles, but for the most part, the glue is going to work the same, okay? So typically I don't go through hot and cold pressing because not a lot of people do that. The one thing I want to mention about that is if you're doing veneers and you don't have a press or a vacuum press, you can use what's called an iron-on veneering technique. Anybody here use an iron-on technique? Okay, so your Titebond original works the best for that. Basically, you would put the glue on one side, on the back side of the veneer, and on the substrate, let it dry. It can be 85, 80% dry. It doesn't have to be totally dry, but you want to make sure that enough water has come out of there that you're not creating blisters as you're ironing it down. Set your iron at cotton. Adjust where your veneer goes, which is going to be a lot different than, say, if I used a contact cement, which I got a one shot at that. This, I got an infinite number of time. I could set it, tape it where I want it. What I want to do is start in the middle with an iron, start working the bubbles out, and without a press, you can get a very, very nice veneer. Okay? We talked about end grain gluing, so I'm not going to get into that. It's starting to get a little long. I could talk about freezing. I could talk about chalk temperature, but do you guys ever run into? Yeah, never mind. That's not going to help you any. We talked about clamping pressure, joint preparation. Again, you want a nice, clean wood surface that mates together relatively smoothly. Anything that will cause the fibers to be damaged, such as saw marks and stuff like that, will glue to that. It's just it tends to fail at a lower strength. Okay? So good, tight-fitting joinery works the best. You've also got a question. Previous slide.
Second line, it says 100 to 15 PSI.
Yeah, so
Seems to be backwards from all the others.
that's 150 actually. So there's a 0 missing on that one. He's very good. You know I put those in there to see if you guys are awake. You believe that, right?
I think it was out, but so a lot of times when you glue things up, then you'll clean that up while it's still wet with like water. Is that a problem? Or?
I've got a slide, so we're going to go on that. I will get there. So this is the true meaning of my presentation, which is the 5 steps of gluing, which is what we want to look at. So the first step is do a dry fit. All right, start laughing. She laughs because I never do this. But what I can say is the most questions that we get to our helpline is how do we get things apart? The issue is we're going to ask you a couple of questions. One is, well, what type of joint is it? And then what type of glue is it? Because we're looking for a weakness, right? But if you've got a joint that is a pegged, pinned mortise and tenon, our statement back to you is going to be, good luck with that one. So really, some joints are going to be easier to get apart. Now let's see if I've got a dovetail joint that I just tacked in place. That's going to be a hell of a lot easier to get apart than one that I fully glued, right? So again, we're looking at that. A miter joint, probably not a big deal. A little bit of heat on those. PVA glues will soften at between 250 and 300 Fahrenheit. So the glue will soften up, and the warmer you get it up to 451. They caught it. You don't want to burn your wood. Start to auto-ignite it at 451. But the glue will soften the warmer that it gets. Okay, so you can use a hair dryer or a heat gun, but be careful of scorching the wood and all of that. CA glues tend to be brittle over time, and so sometimes hitting it very quickly with a hammer will shatter it like glass in some cases, and they can come apart. Hide glue, much better outcome in that particular case. But for the most part, you're going to be wrestling that joint apart. Never a good thing, and that's why we recommend that you do a dry fit. Now, this is the slide that we did. Can you re-glue a joint? Say I took it apart. And this kind of shows that if you do take it apart and within 5 minutes put glue back on it, you'll actually get a stronger joint. And again, we think that the thicker joints allow for more movement, which aligns the polymer as it stretches before it snaps and breaks. What happens if I got to wait overnight or the glue is now fully dry and I have to take it apart? In that particular case, yes, you can glue them back together. I will tell you the bond lines look awful But you'll retain about 75% of the bond strength in that particular case. If you're looking at that going, well, that's not enough. And 75% of 4,000 PSI, which is what Titebond 3 is still 3,000, right? Typically plenty strong enough for most of the domestic hardwoods that we're dealing with. So should be okay, but if you want to get it above, you can always use an epoxy to bond those. The epoxies tend to bond very well to PVA leftovers. Again, those bonds tend to look pretty awful at that point in time. So doing a dry fit is really, really good. Also, it gives you an idea how many clamps you're going to need, so you're not screaming at the kids to get you more clamps while you're, and your wife. She yells back, though. That's the problem. Mask. So when you do the dry fit, that'll help you look at, okay, I've got to take this glue off after the squeeze out. So in that particular case, that's a good time to look at, I can't sand very well in those corners. In that case, put some tape in those areas to catch the squeeze out, and that will help you in terms of that secondary process, which is how do you get the glue out. So you want to determine what the correct glue is, make sure the glue's in good condition. You've got some of these brushes, right? So these brushes are designed. The bristles are of a certain diameter, spaced at a certain amount, so that this will put on the optimum amount of glue on the surface, which is 250 square feet per gallon, or about 6 mils thick, which is about, really, all you need is about 2 pieces of copy paper thick of glue. However, again, that's going to dry pretty fast. So most cases, people are putting more than that on. And thank you. The other thing is, the end on here is flared, like a fishtail. It's a glue scraper. So easy to use as a glue scraper. Gets in corners much better than our competitive products that are out on the marketplace. Once you have one, you'll want more. So you'll find them. You want to mask any iron pipes. So if you're using bar clamps, the iron, make sure you mask them. What you create is that dye, that iron acetate, which can dive pretty far into the wood, and you're going to have a lot of sanding to get those out afterwards. So to avoid those, just make sure you do that. You can use wax paper over stuff if you don't want it to stick to it. The glue won't stick to the wax paper. Prepare your cleanup items. So for cleaning up the glue, what's the best way? So we recommend waiting about 20 minutes for the glue to putty up. Once the glue putties up, you can scrape it up, even if it looks like it's spreading all over the place. Again, all it's doing is rolling. It can't dive into the wood. It can't get close enough to form a good bond. Sands off very easily. Okay? But actually, the best way, we had a video came out by Harp Designs, the guy who used to do the wood for Fixer Upper. He had a video out where he was making it looked to be 8-quarter walnut, big tabletop, gorgeous piece. And he's slathering glue on, and we're going, but he's got dominoes that he's got in there, and he's filling all the holes with glue. And what I'll tell you guys is, because those are not, if you're edge to edge, they're not adding any strength. You really don't need to glue those into place. Just a couple of drops of glue in there to tack them into place is fine. If you fully glue them, and they don't tend to fit very well, you've got a lot of glue in there. That's got a lot of water in there, so it's going to kind of swell that joint for a while. And, later on after it's sanded down and that wood has a tendency to dry out, you may end up with some areas where dips in there where you're going to be able to see where those are. So I just caution you about that. You don't have to glue those in. Now, if you're doing end grain to side grain, in those particular cases, yes. Those will tend to strengthen the joint. You're getting a little more side grain, which is the domino or biscuit or that to side grain in those. So those do help you. So don't get me wrong. They're not, oh no, don't do it. Just edge grain, face grain, not necessary. So you want to get water for the spills. If you get glue on your shirt and you still like your shirt, just get it wet. the glue will not set until it dries, until those particles come together and start to stick together. Keep it wet, get it under the sink, rub it. What you're trying to do is break those particles up. They do like to stick to the cloth, especially if there's cotton in there, which is cellulose. Polyester has hydroxyl groups in it also. So again, if you got it in there, keep it wet and then rinse it out later. If it has dried, you can use a mixture of acetone, water, and vinegar to soften any water-based glue. Okay, usually 50 or 1:1:1 works best. The acetone works the best to soften it, but it evaporates so fast you need the water. And then the acetic acid in the vinegar works with the acetone to help break up those bonds of the vinyl acetate sticking together. What I will say though is if it goes through a dryer cycle and you melt all the glue together, you're never getting it apart anyway. So, yeah. All right. Well, wear your glue proudly. Wear your glue proudly, because I'm going to tell you, not everybody works on such wonderful wood projects. So, all right. And if you're using an epoxy or a polyurethane glue, acetone is going to clean that up the best. Just be careful. It may mar some finishes.
Just related, okay, you haven't talked about cyanoacrylate, super glue, but how do you get stuck fingers from?
So actually what they recommend, and we do have our CA glues, our instant bonds, just a little bit on those. They just say soak your fingers in water. As your skin absorbs water, it expands and pops that bond. So that's sometimes the best way. You can use fingernail polish. It'll soften it, but it's not all that great. There is another chemical. It's hard to find. It's called debonder. It's like a furan or something like that. It's
Some of my glue they gave me a bottle of Behnke.
yeah.
I guess they do.
Yeah, and it works great. It dissolves it much better than the methyl acetate and acetone, which is in the fingernail polish remover and stuff. So
Formulation, it seems like it used to stick a lot better than it does now. Like when I used to use it back in the 70s, I think you couldn't get things to start at all. What we used to use was nitromethane.
yeah, nitromethane, that's the one. This the other one. So how CA glues work, just kind of note. So the CA glues are a solvent type molecule that will react, will basically lock together like, those little kid blocks, those plastic pop blocks is what I call them, just like that. So they're like little pop blocks. No, not Lego. Well, like the beads. Okay. So it is an exothermic reaction and it occurs very, very fast once it starts. To keep it from happening, you have to add acid to that, which is an inhibitor for the cyanoacrylate adhesive, 2-ethyl cyanoacrylate. We add an extra amount to ours, and we give you a 2-year shelf life, which tends to be longer than most people have for theirs. The problem with that is the acid in there, as a wood glue, has a problem sometimes. Let's say if I got oak with high tannic acid, some of the maples will tend to have a high tannic acid. So that will inhibit the glue from working. So in some cases you'll use our glue and you put it together, and normally you'll just start with your glue sucks, but it doesn't. What it is we add the extra acid in there to keep it from reacting, so it gives you a long shelf life. You need the accelerator spray. The accelerator spray has an amine added to it, which will neutralize the acid. That's all it does. You can use baking soda and water, which will neutralize the acid. Will do the same thing. You can use Windex with ammonia D. That will do the same thing. But the accelerator has it in heptane, which tends to penetrate the surfaces a little better than, say, the water-based neutralizers do. And so if you buy CA glue, you should have an accelerator. And the only reason you need the accelerator is if you're putting it on a substrate which is acidic and doesn't neutralize the acid. Okay? And that's it. Your fingers are very basic. That's why they stick very quickly to the amines on your skin. And that's why it reacts on your skin better. Okay. So let's go to the chalk point. We talked about, we didn't open in assembly time, consider gluing in stages. Again, we talked about how much to put on, remove it when it gets slightly rubbery. Clean your caps out afterwards. If you do need new caps, you can call us, we'll send you some. But the clear section pops off, straight off, so you can clean them if you need to. A 9/16" wrench will go in underneath there, help you pop those off. Some of them can be a little difficult to take off.
I just have one quick thing on epoxy that I learned recently, is that spreading it out is very important for your open time. If you leave it heat, it heats faster.
Yeah, so it's an exothermic reaction.
Spread it out and you got a lot.
Spread it out, which will cool it off. And that's what you want to for longer working time with an epoxy.
Which of your glues do you recommend for making putty solids? How
Any of them will work well to make a wood filler out of there.
all of the putties I've tried to make from gray and do not match the wood.
They will not. So if you're looking for a great wood filler that you can use, that is wonderful for hiding, Timbermate wood filler, one of the best out there. It's made with dirt and hide glue, and it sands wonderfully. It accepts stain. What you want to do, what's always best, and it's great for repairing wood surfaces, put it on there. Usually I use the tan color and then get some markers, those repair markers. Test it, what comes out as best color. Then use your markers to match the color of the wood. And then take a black Sharpie and put your grain in. I've fixed things, I know where it is, I still can't find it. So I mean, it's more like having an artist's palette on the surface instead of trying to match, because you're never going to be able to match that. So that Timbermate works wonderfully. So anyway, dry time, give it time to dry. And then questions, I'm going to stick around, I know it's a little late, so I'm going to stick around for questions.